Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. We're going to start our second ELF week, and we are very happy to have our first plenary speaker. He really needs no introduction, but I'm going to quickly read his bio. Robin Walker has been in ELT since 1981. For over 20 years, he taught at the Escuela Universitaria de Turismo de Asturias in Spain before going freelance in 2007 and founding English Global Communication in order to concentrate fully on his work as a teacher trainer, materials writer, and ELT consultant. He regularly collaborates with Oxford University Press, Trinity College London, and many of Spain's state-run education departments. His main interests are pronunciation, English as a lingua franca, ELF, CLIL, and ESP. He is the author of numerous articles on teaching English, including a series of articles on teaching pronunciation in English Teaching Professional, and a similar series on English as lingua franca in Modern English Teacher. Robin is the co-author of OUP's Oxford English for Careers, Tourism, and of different chapters on ELF. He's the author of Teaching the Pronunciation of English as Lingua Franca, a must-have, OUP 2010, title in the OUP Teacher's Handbook series. A former Vice-President of TESOL-SPAIN from 2008 to 2015. He was also the editor of Speak Out, the newsletter of the IATEFL Pronunciation Special Interest Group. Robin, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiago. Thank you for the invitation. Let me see if we can get the screen sharing to work. That means that you should be seeing the title slide. Is that the case?
That's correct.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in these webinars. It's always exciting to be asked to do something like this about ELF because it's a subject very close to my heart. I know I'm following in the steps of some very illustrious speakers from our emails, Tiago. I understand that Jennifer Jenkins made a contribution as well to your work. Of course, Jennifer Jenkins has influenced many, many of us and was the first person that brought ELF to my attention. I have a slightly unusual title for my webinar today. I think the reason for the title will soon become evident. I'd like to start with a tiny little video clip I came across on the internet a couple of years ago, and it seemed to summarize everything that I was trying to sort out in my head about English as a lingua franca and about accents or phonological variation, if you want to call them that by a more formal name. So let's just go up to the UK from Spain and watch the plight of two men who get into a lift and discover that there are no buttons because it's voice activated.
What's the buttons?
No, they installed voice recognition technology in this lift. I heard about this.
Voice recognition technology in a lift in Scotland? You ever tried voice recognition technology?
No.
They don't do Scottish accents.
11.
Could you please repeat that?
11.
We're going to come back to the gentleman in the lift later on a couple of times, but the minute I saw this, I immediately recognized the situation. Now, my heart goes out to the two men because they've got Scottish accents, and I lived all of my younger life in the northeast of England, where Scotland was just an hour away by car. And I'd already also experienced problems of talking to machines with an accent which isn't what we would call a standard accent. So just using my computer and trying to dictate to my computer, I found that it couldn't recognize the word book, because the way I pronounce it from Newcastle in the northeast of England was different to the way it expected the word to be pronounced. But this business of accents, which you can sweep under the carpet if you work in a traditional English as a foreign language framework, actually just keeps coming back up and refusing to go away if you're working with English as a lingua franca. So what I want to do today is look at various things, the first of which is the business of attitudes to accents. Because as I want to try and show, accents are not neutral, and people have attitudes towards different accents, sometimes a positive attitude and sometimes quite a negative attitude. The next thing I want to look at is how we might get into the classroom and start exploring the attitudes that our students also bring with them, possibly to accents in their mother tongue, but certainly to what would constitute an acceptable accent in English, the language they're trying to learn with us. I want to do this because if we don't explore with our own students their own hidden, sometimes deeply hidden attitudes towards accents and towards English accents in particular, then it's very difficult to go anywhere else, such as, for example, learning how to accommodate when you're using English to other people's accents, or learning how to help other people accommodate to your accent. The last thing that I'd like to do today is give you some indications as how we might gain exposure to other people's accents. This for me was particularly important because working in Spain, my students were exposed essentially to one accent, and that would be a Spanish accent of English. And because of their constant exposure to their own accent of English, they began to think that they were intelligible. And so it became important for me to find ways of exposing them to other people's accents, a problem which you don't have if you're working in a place like London, where your students are coming from multiple different mother tongue backgrounds. So this is a little bit the route map for where we're going to go. And as I say, the first thing I think we need to do is explore these attitudes that we all carry towards accents, either in our mother tongue and or, and particularly useful here, towards accents in English. As I say, we all have attitudes to different accents, and often we're not really aware of just how deep some of these attitudes are. For example, traveling back up to Newcastle on the train from London a couple of years ago, I overheard two women talking with a very, very marked Newcastle accent. This was an accent which we'd been told at school repeatedly we had to lose, because if we wanted professional success, we couldn't go into the world with a Newcastle accent. And overhearing these women talking with this very marked and for me really pleasant Newcastle accent, at the same time I assumed something about them and about their professional expertise that turned out to be totally false. They were actually two businesswomen and they were working on a deal. I listened in, which I shouldn't have done, but I wanted to know what they were talking about. And they weren't talking about going out on a Friday night to the pub. They were actually trying to close a business deal. But my attitude to a Newcastle accent, which I'd learned in secondary school, made me completely falsely determine what their business was about, what they were talking about. There's a really excellent book by Rosanna Leapy-Green who talks about accents in the United States and the massive prejudice that people have in the United States to different accents of the same country. Her book is called English with an Accent, and it's a far more formal way of gaining insight into just how deep our prejudices are to accents. Of course, you might ask, yes, but in English language teaching, surely none of this will be true. Surely we won't have attitudes to accents in an enlightened world such as that of English language teaching. But friend and colleague Richard Caldwell, who works out of Birmingham and has done some fabulous stuff on pronunciation and on pronunciation for listening, in this book, Phonology for Listening, points out very, very clearly that everywhere there is a group which will have a prejudice against a particular accent. In other words, there is no such thing as a neutral accent. Accents simply exist, and somewhere there will be somebody who has a prejudice, often not explicit, not even to themselves, about a particular accent. So there you saw my own prejudice about a Newcastle accent because of my upbringing, but also I would admit openly to having a prejudice against an RP accent because of the social implications of an RP accent for those of us who were born well away from London and well away from the political and economic power base of the United Kingdom. So we have prejudices, and that's going to produce attitudes to different accents. And it also produces what I've chosen to call a best accent approach. Reading the work of this Polish phonetician, Spira Kozłowska, she actually looked at the business of accent and intelligibility. She explores the idea of intelligibility very well, in fact. And then she decides that in a world as complex as our own, we need to think about which accent we're going to use in the classroom for our students to model. And she suggests that this model accent obviously should be something that will be beneficial to our learners, and I don't think anybody would ever suggest otherwise. She then, in the next line, goes on to say that non-standard or regional accents, such as my Newcastle accent or such as the Scottish accent of the men in the lift, probably cannot satisfy the requirements of being a model accent in a classroom. And it's at this point that she and I obviously go off in completely different directions. Now, the problem with somebody who's working in research at university level, coming up with the idea that non-standard or regional accents are not acceptable in the classroom, especially as models, is that this rejection of anything except a standard accent then filters down towards teachers, such as ourselves, and ultimately towards our students. And so, for example, when I was working as editor for Speak Out, which is the journal of the IATEFL Pronunciation Special Interest Group, I published an article sent in by a Dutch colleague, Frans Hermans, who'd just actually taken up a job in further education where he was teaching English to those that would become teachers of English. And nervous about not giving a high enough standard of work in his teaching college, he then set about trying to perfect his RP accent. And it fascinated me to read this. Can you imagine hours each week working on his RP accent? And what was interesting was that later in the same article, he admitted that despite this massive investment of time, he'd actually failed to achieve an RP accent. Now, again, this is his choice. He's totally at liberty to choose an accent. But just as he seemed to focus on this accent, the accent that the Polish colleague was suggesting was the only usable accent, then this attitude that he has towards what is the best accent for his use and for his students then filters through into his teaching. And he goes on in the same article to suggest that what we need to do is stop looking at different accents of English and just get all of our students to focus on one generally accepted accent. And surprise, surprise, the generally accepted accent that he's talking to is RP or a General American, which is the US equivalent to RP. Now, as I'm reading this, for example, the word frantically struck me as absolutely unnecessary. As teachers, we don't go around frantically trying to expose our students to different accents. We actually do this strategically. We're doing this on purpose as part of their educational program in English. But Franz went deeper into this and made it absolutely clear that he saw no point whatsoever in teaching people how to deal with accents such as now a South African accent or an Australian accent, even if it's only meant for receptive purposes. Those are italics on my italics. But he can't see the point of, and again, his choice of language is very interesting, forcing students to study in order to understand English with a mild or heavy Scottish accent. Goodness gracious, what sort of world does he imagine his students are going out into? He's not even preparing them to deal with a very basic reality, that English is spoken with a huge multitude of accents all around the world. In fact, what he suggested instead was that we teach our students the same accent. He said that this would be RP and that this was a nice accent, and that then students from Holland could speak to students from Italy because they'd all be using the same accent. Well, for me, this throws up all sorts of issues. And obviously, one of the issues is why it should be RP. And people from a US area of influence would obviously contest that. But actually, people from Australia would contest that as well. And if you're a teacher in Dublin, in Ireland, then I don't think you would want to be teaching English with an RP accent, given the historical tensions between Ireland and the United Kingdom in the past. So this is problematic. And this best accent approach, I think, can be summed up, I hope summed up correctly, in a number of points. That accents are inevitable, and perhaps, I'm reading between the lines here, regrettable, that some accents are actually difficult to understand, that if everyone were to use the same accent, and in Franz's article, he points out that this would be basically RP if you're working in Europe, then you're going to guarantee full intelligibility. And the standard accent, RP, as I say, is the easiest accent to understand. And therefore, as teachers, we should all be teaching students to use and to be ready to understand that same best standard accent. Okay, there is a certain logic to this argumentation, but clearly I don't agree, or I wouldn't be here tonight. Now, I don't agree, and I'm not the only one who doesn't agree. And coming back to Richard Caldwell, in his book, Phonology for Listening, Richard examines quite a significant number of different accents from different parts of the world, native speaker and non-native speaker, and points out that all of these are legitimate ways of speaking English. He talks about them as flavors or colors, rather than having something that is monolithic. And he goes on to suggest that, in his case, working towards improved listening skills, then students need to be prepared for a wide range of English accents. And it's a range of English accents that is continually widening as English deepens in its role as lingua franca around the world. Clearly, I agree with this stance from Richard Caldwell. It's my own stance. And what follows now is about this business of preparing students in order that they can deal with a wide range of accents, and in order that they're not, shall we say, trapped in the lift when they're using English because of their accent or because of other people's accents. I'm suggesting that we don't take a best accent approach, which is essentially the model which has driven English as a foreign language up until now. I suggest that we step fully and consciously into the world of English as a lingua franca, being used for global communication, and that in terms of pronunciation teaching, we take on a multiple accent approach. Here, we would say that accents are inevitable, which they are, but I would add undesirable, which I believe them to be. We would also accept, and this is simply a linguistic fact, that no accent is inherently the most intelligible. And there's interesting work from people like David Graddle, who works from Lancaster University and has done 2 studies of English for the British Council. Also small-scale studies by colleagues around the world that clearly indicate that no accent is actually automatically more intelligible than any other. One of the small-scale studies I most enjoyed reading and editing when I was working with Pronsig on Speak Out suggested that in an international meeting, in this case it was the Davos Economic Forum, which is held once a year at approximately this time of the year, translators and interpreters from Japan had the most difficulty understanding David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time and has an absolutely standard RP accent, and yet to those Japanese translators was significantly less intelligible than other world leaders who did not have English as their first language. So this is quite an important point, I think, for us to grasp. It's a simple linguistic fact that no accent is inherently the most intelligible. Another issue to take into account, and it was something that Franz Hermans admitted himself, that despite his hours and hours spent with RPs and listening to the BBC and podcasts and so on, he wasn't able to perfect an English accent, an RP accent. And most of our students don't have even vaguely like the time he clearly dedicated to perfecting this. And in my own case, for example, I've lived in Spain for 37 years, speaking predominantly Spanish in my life, very significantly predominantly Spanish. And after 10 minutes in a taxi, the taxi driver is already asking me where I'm from and pointing out that by my accent, I'm clearly not Spanish. Another point to be borne in mind with a multiple accent approach is that a best accent ideology actually is very disempowering. So if we choose RP as the best accent and put this as the goal for our students and as the accent to be modeled by our teachers, first of all, we're setting the students a target which most will not achieve. And secondly, we disempower teachers who do not have this accent. Therefore, you're disempowering thousands, tens of thousands of non-native speaker teachers around the world who don't have the particular best accent. But you're also disempowering native speakers of English who also don't have that accent. And that's my own case, for example, because I came from the north of England, then I say things like glass, and I say fast and not fast, and so on and so forth. And I remember talking to a friend, a superb teacher, who was doubting his own teaching in terms of pronunciation because he'd been born in Glasgow. The fact that he traveled the whole world and had been intelligible to people all over the world with his Glasgow accent didn't seem enough justification to him that he should teach his students how to pronounce. He felt and admitted to feeling disempowered. The last thing that needs pointing out is that accent is not the same as intelligibility. And intelligibility is what most students actually require from their classes with us, that they can go out and speak in English and be understood without necessarily achieving perfection with respect to one particular standard accent. There's some very interesting work that's come out of Canada by Tracy Derwing and Murray Monroe on accent and intelligibility. I imagine they've done work in this area because Canada is such a multi-accented country, having been born out of immigration. And in their early work on accent and intelligibility, Derwing and Monroe conclude accent and intelligibility are not the same. okay, that they can be connected, but they are not actually the same thing. And we need to stop conflating them and actually separate them in our minds. And most students, if they're clearly presented with what is accent and what is intelligibility, will then realize that what they need with English is to be intelligible, not to have a particular prestige accent. Successful accents. Well, here are two Brazilians who, the minute I listened to them on YouTube 2 days ago, were clearly not native speakers of English. But they are both very successful people. Okay, Felipe Massa, I'm sure everybody will recognize. And I'm digging around for my notes as to the other person, because I didn't know her at all, but listened to her on YouTube. She's Maria de Graça Silva Foster, and she's the Chief Executive Officer of Petrobras. And it was really fascinating to listen to their accents, because they were both totally and completely intelligible, but neither had a native speaker accent. And both are massively successful people. I think that's useful for us to realize that having an accent, which is not a native speaker accent, does not mean, as we were told when I was at school in Newcastle upon Tyne, having an accent which is not the standard accent of the country or is not a native speaker accent, this does not mean that you cannot be successful in your chosen career. Okay, well, as you can see, this whole business of people's attitudes to accents is quite complex, and it's something that it's, I think, worth reading about. And I would strongly recommend that book by Rosanna Lippi-Green, English with an Accent, because the sort of prejudices to accent that she describes within the United States are true everywhere, at least in terms of accents of English. Of course, what I'm talking about here, these attitudes, are also within our students, including their attitudes towards accents of English and what they think they want from classes. And that would need exploring with them to help them actually understand their own attitudes to accents. And I've done this with my own students, especially with teachers in training with me, by beginning with their own language and the accents of their own language. And one of the first exercises I did here in Spain with teachers who were on a pronunciation course with me was to get them to think about Spanish. And I'm sure if you do this with Brazilian Portuguese, then you're going to come up with a substantial list of different accents. And I asked my students, you know, think of Spanish, your mother tongue, and look for 5. Can you find 10 accents? Make a list. And then just note down which of these you like best and which one you like least. There were about 30 teachers in the group, and they set about working on this and then sharing their answers to 2 and 3. And they easily came up with a list of more than 10 accents of Spanish. I then sent them on to 2 more questions. And these 4th and 5th questions were the ones you see on the screen now. And what was really interesting was that the classroom suddenly went silent. There'd been a lot of humorous chat and a lot of leg pulling about different accents because the teachers themselves had different accents of Spanish. But when I asked them to associate these adjectives with these different regional and international accents of Spanish, quite to my surprise, all of the banter and the exchange between students and groups actually dwindled until there was a noticeable silence in the room. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, well, it's wrong to be doing this. It's bringing out prejudices. You shouldn't be associating qualities because of an accent. You shouldn't be associating hard working with Catalonia because of their accent. And they'd actually pulled out an ethical problem. And this is the sort of thing that Rosanna Lippi-Green talks about in her book, that it's very, very dangerous for us to allow ourselves to be dragged towards this association of certain qualities because of certain accents. and that we need to start undoing these, sometimes, as I say, deeply hidden prejudices that we all carry. And when we came back as a whole class, we started talking about this in Spanish, actually. And they realized that each one of them was guilty of making certain associations between certain accents and certain qualities. And that this subconscious association wasn't really acceptable ethically. So that was a very interesting session that I didn't expect the outcome that I got that day, but I've used the activity since and had similar outcomes. This realization that we mustn't fall into this trap of associating certain things to certain accents and certain people because of their accent. Another activity I've done in class with students of English, rather than with teachers of English, is to actually get them to judge how they feel about certain statements. So I usually give them a very simple scale from 1 to 5. So 1's total agreement, 5 is total disagreement. They're used to this sort of thing with me. It's essentially a Likert scale. And then I give them some statements, which I'm going to show you now, all of which I simply picked up, either by listening to people in the classroom or listening to people in the street or following emails and other broadcast information. Now, it's quite interesting when I let students loose on these statements, and each one individually would put a 1 to 5 next to each statement, which is their personal thought on that statement. Then they get into small groups and talk about them. Normally, they totally agree with the first one. The second one immediately begins to produce a certain amount of discussion because they've been out in the world, they've used their English, and they've discovered that actually some native speakers are considerably harder to understand than non-native speakers, despite the fact that the non-native speaker doesn't have a good accent. They quickly spot that RP would be a good accent if you were in a European environment, but people from Australia, United States, etc., certainly wouldn't want to be imitating an RP accent. The last two are very interesting because the last two statements I picked up from experts in pronunciation, and they said these statements on electronic lists or electronic blogs. And number 4, you see a bad accent is like wearing shabby clothes in an interview. It gives a bad impression. What is the person saying when they say a bad accent? I mean, exactly how are they defining bad? And of course, we end up discovering that this is a purely subjective assessment of the accent. And a bad accent is, in this case, from the person who said this, one which is not RP. In which case, clearly, I've got a bad accent, but then again, so has 98% of the UK. So these value judgments, a bad accent, this is what we need to warn against. These are these hidden attitudes. And the last one, you know, the volcanologist in question was actually Italian, and he kept saying volcano. And the suggestion was that because this scientist was incapable of spotting that it wasn't volcano, that it was volcano, that his science would be pretty unreliable. This was in a blog by a man called John Wells, who knows an immense amount about pronunciation. And he said that the fact that the Italian volcanologist couldn't say volcano and kept saying volcano meant that he clearly wasn't a very good scientist. Now, when I've shown this to scientists who are students of mine and are learning English for international communication, they're absolutely appalled that somebody should think that because you say volcano and not volcano, that you're a bad scientist. And they regularly go to international conferences where they recognize people are pronouncing a word in a way they wouldn't use, but the word's clearly intelligible, and what matters is the person's science and not the person's accent. So these are 2 activities that I've done. Let's go back to our men in the lift.
What's the buttons?
Oh no, they installed voice recognition technology in this lift. I heard about this.
Voice recognition technology in a lift in Scotland. You ever tried voice recognition technology?
No.
They don't do Scottish accents.
11.
Could you please repeat that?
11.
11. 11.
11.
Could you please repeat that?
11.
Whose idea was this? You need to try an American accent. 11. 11.
That sounds Irish, not American.
What, doesn't it? 11.
Where in America is that? Dublin?
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that?
Try an English accent, right? 11. 11.
You for the same part of England as Dick Van Dyke.
And the same Eurozone.
What the two men do when the lift doesn't understand them with their Scottish accents is try to accommodate to the lift. So they try an English accent and they try an American accent and it doesn't work and they're still stuck in the lift. But this business of accommodating is really important. Jennifer Jenkins, who I mentioned at the beginning and who's been who started the whole ball rolling when it comes to pronunciation for ELF, in her 2000 book, she actually talks about the need to be able to accommodate, that is to change your way of behaving in order to suit the person you're speaking to, you're working with. She talks about productive accommodation, and in the quote she gives in the book, there are two students looking at a picture. One is describing one of the pictures. There are several pictures in front of the other student, and by listening to the description, the listener has to decide which picture the speaker is talking about. The speaker B is Japanese and actually gets to the point where they say Gley House, and the listener, who's Swiss German, doesn't understand, and speaker B spots the frown and realizes, yeah, that's one of my problems, this thing, and makes a conscious adjustment of their speech and says grey instead of the previous gley, and then A understands. So this would be a person who's actually consciously adjusting their speech to something that is more intelligible to their interlocutor. A lot of my Spanish students still struggle at quite advanced levels with B and V, and I point out, always have this in the back of your mind. If you see someone's not actually understanding you, check that this is actually being correctly pronounced. And they've said that being conscious of these problems that they, as Spanish speakers of English, generate for other people who don't know Spanish and don't speak Spanish, having that in their mind allows them to make these accommodations and therefore be more intelligible. So this is one way in which we can accommodate to the other person by actually adjusting our speech consciously. Another way you could accommodate, for example, would be to leave out some of the connected speech features of English that are so typical of native speakers, but as Richard Caldwell's work points out, can make you actually quite difficult to listen to. This business of adjustment was also picked up on, again, it's these two people, isn't it? It's Derwing and Monroe, when they were working in Canada, but this was in terms of receptive accommodation. They noticed there were problems with Vietnamese immigrants in Canada and their social workers, and they took young social workers and they showed them what to expect as listeners to Vietnamese people recently arrived in Canada and speaking English, obviously without a very high command of the language. And they focused the attention of these social workers on the pronunciation difficulties of Vietnamese speakers of English. And they said they will tend to do this, they will tend to simplify consonant clusters, and so on and so forth. Because of the information that the social workers had received from Derwing and Monroe, when they went back to working with Vietnamese speakers of English, they were able far better to accommodate their listening to what the speakers were saying to them. And at the end of the study, the social work students were able to indicate a massive gain in confidence in their interactions with these Vietnamese speakers of English. So we're looking at two types of accommodation there. The productive accommodation, as we saw through the work of Jennifer Jenkins, where the speaker modifies the way they speak until they are finally understood by the listener, and receptive accommodation, where the listeners alter what they expect from the speaker or move towards what can be expected from the speaker, and therefore are more easily able to understand them. Mark Hancock, another Pronsig member and someone who did a lot of his early teaching in Brazil, says that an alternative to the Derwing and Monroe approach, which focuses on one particular speech group, in this case Vietnamese speakers of English, Mark suggests that another thing is to look at sounds of English which are regularly pronounced in different ways by speakers with different L1 backgrounds. And he then went on to generate some activities based on what he called the vulnerable sounds of English, vowels and consonants that are often pronounced in different ways by people of different first language backgrounds. So here we have 8 vulnerable sounds, and the exercise is exemplified here, where speaker A says, "Phew, it's hot in here." And speaker B answers, "Yeah, the eating's on I, I'll turn it down." This dropping of the H would be one of the variations that is quite frequent, and that as a listener you would have to accommodate to until you'd spotted that this person is dropping the H, and then it becomes easier to understand what they're saying. Example 2, Dublin's 2 hours behind Moscow, isn't it? Oh, I thought it was tree. And of course, an Irish accent wouldn't use the interdental fricative, I thought, or 3. It uses a dental plosive and says, I thought it was tree. So here's another exercise, in this case, focusing on sounds that are often pronounced in various ways in English by speakers from different backgrounds. The point here is that accents aren't going to go away. The idea that we might all learn one single accent, as was proposed by my colleague Frans Hermans, simply isn't going to happen. And therefore, what we need to be able to do is to accommodate 2 different accents, either accommodating by changing our way of speaking until the interlocutor understands us, or by learning how to deal with people's accents as they come to us, learning how to adjust our expectations as a listener, and therefore accommodate receptively to the different accents we're going to meet. Clearly, accommodating receptively is easier for most people than accommodating productively. Often our students, when they go out into the world, are at the limit of what they can do in terms of their productive pronunciation, but can easily be helped to understand other people's accents, especially if we expose them to those other accents. The person that most influenced my thinking here in this respect is John Field. His book on listening in the language classroom is very, very strongly recommended. It helps me, at least it helped me to understand so much of what's happening in listening and the pronunciation side of listening. And one of the things that Field points out is that actually the listening process is this product of all of our previous experiences as a listener, and that by listening to many people, and obviously therefore with many different accents, what we do is accumulate mental traces of the different phonological systems, and that finally allows us to understand what people are saying with reasonable accuracy, initially with accents that we're constantly in contact with, But as this number of accent grows, eventually you become able to deal even with accents you've never heard before, or you only hear just very occasionally. You simply get so much data as to how a word can be pronounced in different ways that when it's pronounced away from what would be a standard pronunciation, you're still perfectly able to understand it. Julia Scales in the United States worked also on students' perceptions of accents. Students at university who often are exposed to different accents of English and not native speaker accents of English. And she concluded that it would be very useful for students, native speaker and non-native speaker, to actually hear different accents, analyze different accents, and compare the key features amongst a range of different accents. And that by doing this, you would get better and better at listening to English spoken with a wide range of different accents, even when some of those accents were completely new to you. That would help you with your listening comprehension. It would increase your flexibility as a listener, but it would also improve your respect for the reality of the different accents with which English is spoken in the world today. Now, how do we explore those accents and how do we expose people to other people's accents? Well, there are different resources that I've come across, and I'm sure there are many, many more, but one of the most useful is the Speech Accent Archive. This is a United States university, and what they did was take a standard phrase written by phoneticians and get people from all over the world, native and non-native speakers, to read the same paragraph, and they've recorded these and made them available. There are many, many recordings on this site, and your students will surely be able to find various recordings of people from Brazil speaking English and reading this citation paragraph. My own students, they use the interactive map and they go immediately to the north of Spain, to our capital city, which is called Oviedo, and they listen to somebody who's from Oviedo actually saying the elicitation paragraph. It's a very strange paragraph because it was written by phoneticians in order to include as many, not just individual sounds, but consonant clusters and sound combinations as the English language will allow. But it's fascinating for students to listen to the same paragraph spoken with multiple different accents, and they tend to go clicking on the interactive map and see what an Italian person would do, see what a person from Russia would do with the phrase, and they start fixing on the way that different people from different mother tongue backgrounds actually deal with different complexities of this elicitation paragraph. Another really useful site for exposing your students and giving them really interesting exposure to multiple different accents from around the world is this English listening lesson library online. That's 3 L's, where there are more than 1,500 different recordings, and where students can listen and, if necessary, read the transcript of the recordings. And this would allow them to focus on different aspects of different accents, get used to these different accents, and therefore increase their communication flexibility. If you want an article which will help you in your own work get introduce this business of learners listening to different accents, then I'd recommend you go here. This is Laura Patsko and Katie Simpson, and this article will help you introduce listening to different accents into your own classroom. And a page that I recommend is this My English Voice, which was set up by Katie Simpson. She was living in Thailand at the time and therefore able to access people from all over the world who were traveling through Southeast Asia and get them to talk about their English, their own English, with its own accent, and their attitudes towards their non-standard accents of English, and whether they would like to change for a standard English accent or not. A whole lot of things connected to our earlier considerations of students' attitudes to accents and to their own accent. This is a really nice site, and I hope that Katie is able to continue developing it. Also really interesting to get students to listen to different accents is this site, Youglish, which you're probably familiar with. But this was a French computer software author who is tired of standard pronunciations in online dictionaries, because he said the words, when I'm working in my field, the words come in sentences and they seem to be changed when they're in a sentence. So he wrote an algorithm which allows the software to go through 20 million YouTube tracks and find examples of a word you are searching for. I found this quite incredible, and I actually put in the word alchemist. It's quite an old word, it's barely used today. And I thought, we'll see just how good your search engine is. It actually came up with 61 examples of alchemist. And what it does is take you to the exact moment in the YouTube clip in which the speaker says the word alchemist, and you get the text and the context in which it's said. And again, what you discover is that it's the same word, but it's said in multiple different ways because of people's different accents. So again, we're exposing students to other people's accents. These are a range of sites. Another thing is, if you have a scripted text, such as the one in the Speech Accent Archive, then if you have a little protocol in class, you can really exploit these. And it's this protocol that I suggest in chapter 5 of my book on teaching the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca. So the first thing will be to get the students to listen to the text you're going to work on until they're completely familiar with it, so that they understand the whole text. They have no problems with vocabulary or intelligibility of the text you've chosen, because if they're struggling with the content, they can't focus on the pronunciation. The next thing you do is get them to listen to the chosen text, such as the one in the Speech Accent Archive, or another one which I actually wrote for the CD, which goes with my own book. But you get them to listen to the standard text in 3 or 4 different accents. And I would make the accents quite radically different one from the other. So an accent from Southeast Asia, a Russian accent, an Argentinian accent, for example, and a French accent. That would make a nice foursome. You then, if you wish, get them to listen to the text in the different accents and allow the students to try and guess where the speakers of each accent are from. They're not usually very successful, but it's a nice little activity. And then finally, we get into the real stuff, where we would read the script of the text, and having read it and fully understood the whole of the script, we then listen again to one or other accent and actually make notes about the way the speaker pronounces different words or word combinations that were odd or unexpected. And in this way, you're getting your students to do what Julia Scale suggested. They're now analyzing accents, and they're spotting, oh goodness, this Japanese speaker did this. Yes, but the Russian speaker didn't do that, but then in another part did something else. This is involving the students not just in listening for understanding, which would be the first bullet point here, the familiarization, but actually now listening and analyzing. How does this accent work? What changes does it make that I wouldn't have expected? And then this is what then equips students to go on and listen again out there in the real world, and to accommodate their listening to the different accents they're going to encounter. And just
What's the buttons?
Oh no, they installed voice recognition technology in this lift. I heard about this.
Voice recognition technology in a lift in Scotland. You ever tried voice recognition technology?
No.
They don't do Scottish accents.
11.
Could you please repeat that?
11.
11. 11.
11.
Could you please repeat that?
11.
Whose idea was this? You need to try an American accent. 11. 11.
That sounds Irish, not American.
Doesn't it?
11. Where in America is that? Dublin.
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that?
Try an English accent. Right?
11. 11. You for the same part of England as Dick Van Dyke.
Listen, you're saying smart ass.
Please speak slowly and clearly.
Smart ass.
11.
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that?
11. If you don't understand the lingo, away back home to your own country.
That last bit is especially significant. If you don't understand the lingo, away back home to your own country, away back home to your own country. It's touched, this little video is apparently crazy, but it's not so crazy. It's touched upon something that's really important. You see, he's Scottish, and the lift refuses to deal with his Scottish accent. And he's deeply offended by this because his right to speak with his own accent is being denied by the lift. And the problem is, I think so far in English language teaching, we've denied many people the right to speak English with their own accent, the accent which displays their identity, who they are. I think that it's time that we move to a position where people can speak English, where they will be intelligible with their English, but intelligible with their English in an accent which, if they choose, allows them to say who they are and where they're from. Accents are inevitable and, I strongly believe, desirable. I would hate to see a world in which English was spoken with only one accent. It's important to remember no accent is inherently the most intelligible accent. For most of our students, even if they were to choose an accent, their chances of success in perfecting that accent are virtually zero. And most of our students don't even have half of the time that it would take in order to achieve that perfection. The best accent ideology, the idea that RP is the accent or GA is the accent and that anything less is failure, disempowers virtually everybody in ELT. It disempowers students because most of them are therefore bound to fail. And I don't really think that's what teaching should be about. Teaching is about success, not guaranteed failure. And it disempowers teachers who are non-native speakers and don't have the particular so-called best accent. And it disempowers native speakers, the vast majority, who also don't have the so-called best accent. Accent, as Dowing and Monroe have pointed out again and again, does not mean intelligibility. And today, with English as a global language, intelligibility is far more useful to students than a particular accent that may or may not be intelligible to other people. Increased exposure, and this is following up on the work from John Field, increased exposure to a range of different accents increases your flexibility as a listener to deal with different accents. So we would start small, but ultimately we would expose students strategically more and more to different accents so that one day they can deal with whichever accent comes their way. Last of all, as we saw in this very last bit of the incident of the men in the lift, your accent is who you are. And getting people to change their accent can have serious effects on how they feel about themselves and how other people perceive them. So it's very, very dangerous, I think, to just assume that people need to have one particular accent, because this is then robbing them of the opportunity to speak intelligibly, but to actually show their identity as Brazilian speakers of English, as Spanish speakers of English, as Japanese speakers of English, through their accent in English. If you were to look for more on this, well, obviously that's why I wrote this book, for the handbook for OUP. to give people deeper insights into the whole business of the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca and things like dealing with accents, the sort of stuff we've gone through too quickly today out of necessity. If you want a quicker way into that, as Tiago mentioned at the beginning, I wrote a series of articles on English as a lingua franca for Modern English Teacher. And actually, without buying Modern English Teacher, they've kindly given me PDFs of the final articles. And you can access these PDFs from my website, englishglobal.com, wordpress.com/articles. And I've highlighted here the two that you'll probably be most interested in on the basis of what we've talked about today. So at that point, I think, Tiago, you need to take over in case there are any questions, or I don't know how it works at this point.
Well, you can be sure there are. So Robin, first of all, thank you so much. That was really insightful. Lots of food for thought. And we do have lots of questions here. Priscilla, would you like to start and ask him the first question?
Yeah. So you're going to read out the questions for you, okay, Robin? There are some questions in the comment section in the YouTube video that you. So we're going to start with Fabiana, and she's asking about official assessment. When I saw her question, actually, I took Robin's book from my shelf here, my bookshelf, to read about it, but nothing better than asking him about it. So she is asking about assessment, such as Cambridge exams or Trinity exams. How is ELF seen in this scenario, and is ELF taken into account in assessment? And how about unofficial ones that we do in our classrooms that we prepare, the assessment we prepare in class? For example, what do we do with ELF in this context when students are looking for a job and they're going to be assessed, their English is going to be assessed? How do we do with ELF in this scenario?
Okay, Priscilla, this is quite a... Obviously, this worries us enormously as teachers, especially today where people have to gain some type of certification in English in order to access a job or access grants at university. This is a really important point.
Robin, just 1 second. I think there's something, you're still sharing your screen because we can see you.
Yeah, I realize that, but this has done something to me. Do you want me to go out and come back into the room?
No, I think if you just stop sharing, if you go over the green stripe, maybe there's going to be something there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Now we can see you.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay. No, now you're sharing it again.
Now you're sharing it again.
I'll try again.
Yeah. Yes, now we can see you.
Now we can see you.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Okay. So it's a really important point. The first thing I would say is you need to look at the criteria used by your exam board. If they use a specified native speaker accent as part of their criteria for assessing spoken English, you have to train your students towards that accent, because this is what they've asked us to do. They've come to us and said, I have to pass this exam. The exam says I have to have a reasonably good RP or GA accent, whichever one the exam board specifies. Well, our job is to train students towards that exam. These are the rules. However, throughout my whole presentation, at the bottom, you would see the name of my company, English Global Communication, and then you would see the name of a major exam board, Trinity College London. And as an exam board, Trinity College London makes no reference at any time to any accent as the desired accent for passing the exam. The references regularly made are to do with international intelligibility. And therefore, as an exam board, Trinity College has actually absorbed the ideas of ELF without actually using the acronym. And that's, surprise, surprise, one of the reasons why I'm happy to be working so often with Trinity College here in Spain, is because we share the same philosophy in terms of accent. However, if students were to come to me, for example, an exam at my local university, and I read the conditions of the exam, and I discover that the exam will judge their pronunciation on their proximity to RP, then I would give them specific coaching to get their Spanish accented English as clear, as close as possible to RP in the time I've got available. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. Well, I think it answers her question, and that's what she wanted to know. She wanted to know about the what to do with assessment and ELF, and I think it's we can conciliate, we can have both ideas together. Although it has a little like controversy on ELF and assessment, there are some discussions, but I think it's possible.
Can I just also introduce there something which came my way only a few months ago, but the European Union has updated the Common European Framework.
Yeah, yeah.
The update in terms of phonological control is total. They ditched absolutely everything of the original Common European Framework, and in the introduction to the new descriptors, they suggest that obsessing about a native speaker accent has been very, very damaging to the teaching of pronunciation in Europe for any European language. And of course, that therefore spills over into English. And they make very clear that in the future, for the use of additional languages in Europe, the goal is intelligibility in that language, and that traces of your mother tongue phonological system should be expected and are completely acceptable. So I think with something as powerful as the Common European Framework saying that intelligibility is the goal, exam boards are going to have to follow. And the only thing, again, to wave a little Trinity flag is they don't have to follow. They're already there.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the next question then. There's another question from Fabiana asking whether a different accent could be a criteria for elimination, but I think you've answered that, like it can't be, right? An accent can't be a criteria for elimination, I think. That's what I got from what you just said.
That's right, and I'll just add something, again, which I picked up from Murray Monroe. He wrote an article and explained the actual legislation in Canada which forbids discrimination based on accent. And initially, when I read about this legislation, I thought, how on earth do you demonstrate in a court that you didn't get a job because of your accent? And my wife pointed out, come on, we've already been there. Initially, people said, how on earth do you demonstrate in a course that you didn't get, in a court, that you didn't get a job because of the color of your skin? But nobody would. So she said, these things which appear intangible are not intangible, but somebody has to go to court and say, I was discriminated against because of my accent, and this has happened in Canada. And obviously, courts are courts. Some of the decisions by the judge have said, no, there was no discrimination. I'm sorry, your case doesn't hold. And other times the court has said, yes, there's clearly been discrimination. This person must be allowed access to the job.
Yeah. Well, we have other questions. Ellen, she wants to know, how can we address students' automatic association of fluency to copying a native, usually American English?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, that's the bit that perhaps I haven't done so well today. Webinars are not my strong point. But we need to show students that we have these different prejudices inside us. And the opposite to prejudices is this business of overvaluing certain things. In this case, when you're learning a language, when you're learning English, placing too much value on the native speaker accent as the ultimate goal. And I think what's interesting to explore here are those examples. I mentioned the one from the Japanese interpreters, where native speakers have turned out not to be the most intelligible. And this first came my way with my own students when they were doing Erasmus exchange in the United Kingdom. So the Spanish have this reputation that, you know, they have fantastic parties, and my students said, you know, they'd be relaxing on a Friday night, and there were students from all over Europe in the party, and everyone understood everyone until the native speaker student from Birmingham started to talk to them. And nobody understood the Birmingham student, and the Birmingham student was complaining that they didn't understand anybody at the party. Yeah, the first time my students came back and told me this, I just thought it was just purely anecdotal. I ignored it. I just thought that perhaps they were all drinking too much. My wife teaches on a international European program. She has students in class when the program is actually here in the north of Spain, who are from all over Europe. And year after year, the most difficult moment for her is when the native speaker student joins in the discussion, because nobody understands that student, and yet they've all understood each other. And she, as the teacher, has to smooth all of this out, except that she admits that sometimes she doesn't understand the UK native speaker. So there are these anecdotal evidences, but people's own real life experiences. And constantly they come back to the same thing, that when English is being used as an international language, native speakers do not have any particular advantage. And in many cases, and this was the work that David Graddle pointed out in his research with the British Council, the native speakers are the problem, actually. Now, when students are introduced to this, in my experience, they've all nodded their heads and said, yeah, we've been there. We've been in this situation. It's really embarrassing. Here's the native speaker. Nobody understands them. And they clearly don't understand us. And there's actually work which goes back to the 1990s that was done at Honolulu. And the researchers played people with 8 different accents. One was a US accent of English. One was a UK accent of English. 9 different accents. And 7 were non-native speaker accents of English. They then allowed native speakers and non-native speakers at the university to listen to the recordings and to just simply say intelligible, not intelligible, totally intelligible. I had to struggle a bit, that sort of intuitive response. And the outcome of this research was that the native speakers were judged to be the least intelligible, and they were also the least able as listeners to deal with non-native speaker accents. This is the sort of information that students should be shown. That if you work the hours and hours that Franz Hermann did put in to achieve a native speaker accent, you're not even guaranteeing your intelligibility with English as a lingua franca. Oh, now
Sorry.
I can't.
Yeah, Priscilla is muted. Let me see if we have another question.
Sorry.
That's okay. So we have lots of comments here, people saying, thank you, the talk was really insightful. Another teacher saying that sometimes students insist on the fact that speaking English fluently means pronouncing some words correctly, whatever that might be. To wrap up, we have Bella Combe asking if she would like to hear some ideas on how to deal with the students' prejudiced expectations. I think you covered that already with the examples
I
you
would
mentioned.
just suggest, because I've covered that in the talk, I also cover it in those 2 articles which are on my website. And so it's probably easier to read the articles, and that will allow what I said today to settle, because I was conscious of going very quickly and with no feedback available. Normally I'm speaking live and I can see people's faces. Then obviously I'm sort of obliged to go on at an even speed, and possibly I didn't explain it as well as I might have. But everything about how to raise awareness about accents and the validity of accents, all of that is covered in those 2 articles, which are downloadable completely free from my website.
That's excellent. Priscilla, would you like to talk about the certificates?
Yes. So I'm going to share my screen really quick so everybody can see the link. Now, here. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Here.
not anymore.
Can everybody see it? So
Yes.
now you can all go to this link to get your certificate. So you're gonna fill in the form to get your certificate. So it's gonna be open for 1 hour, for the next hour. So it's bit.ly/BrELT ELF 2019 RW. Okay, so you have 1 hour or 30 minutes. I don't remember. I think it's an hour, right, Thiago?
I think it's 30 minutes.
30 minutes then. You have 30 minutes to go there, fill in the form so you can have your certificates for this webinar.
That's wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robin, for your time and your participation. And everyone, stay tuned, because tomorrow at 7 p.m., we're going to have Lucia Rodriguez talking about English as a lingua franca and how it affects the design of courses. Thank you very much, and
Thank
see you all
you.
tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.